Hello, I'm Max Williams. I'm doing the motion breakdowns for round 6. Brief personal introduction before we get started here. I'm from Edmonton, Alberta originally. I've been debating now for about 9 years. I really like debate. It's a good way to meet cool people. You get to go to some interesting places. And also you get to go to Calgary, which is not such an interesting place, but I forgive it. And you get to have a lot of fun arguing. As you all know, great time. BP Nationals, kind of a special tournament for me. I remember the first BP Nationals I ever went to. I think I took I can't remember how many rounds they were doing then, but at least half of my rounds I got the 4 in. And I went back the next year, and I missed the break by 1 point. We took all seconds in all 6 rounds. And then the last year I did BP Nationals, which is in 2021, we won the tournament. So let that be a message of inspiration to you. No matter how this one goes, you can always come back. Unless you graduate, in which case you better try hard this time. Okay, this motion. So I want to start out by giving some general advice about motions like this. I want to talk a little bit about the rules governing a motion like this. And then I want to work through some argument ideas and maybe one in-depth construction just to help you in future rounds. So firstly, what kind of motion is this? So I think the most relevant type for a motion like this, it's a motion about social movements. And so that's going to tip us off to a few important, maybe heuristics that are going to be important when you're doing a round like this. So the first is, no matter how the motion is phrased, the actor is going to be really important in a round like this. And it's going to be important because the actor is a little bit unusual, especially because so many motions have you debating from the perspective of or about government action or the action of a business or a particular person. Here, the feminist movement is not a group with a organizational hierarchy. It doesn't have a formal membership structure. It's this kind of decentralized social movement where people voluntarily affiliate based on whether they agree with the ideas of the movement. So that's going to really affect a lot of things about the debate. I think the most important thing it affects, and this is the second thing we want to keep in mind, is the means of influence. So unlike the government, unlike a single person, this movement works in a kind of different way in terms of how it affects the world. And so when we're making our arguments, we want to be very cautious about the kinds of impacts that we're reaching for, and making sure that, one, those are impacts that are realistic in terms of what the movement can actually accomplish. And secondly, that we've actually demonstrated that as a result of the motion, or maybe if you're opposing the motion, without the motion, the thing you're talking about would actually happen. And that's a very common mistake that I see in these kinds of rounds, is just trying to prove too much. We'll say avoid. Proving too much, it could mean trying to take on too many different arguments in your case. It could mean picking an argument that just requires too much proof to work well. So maybe on this motion, an argument saying that will end sexism or something like that. It's just a bit too ambitious for a motion like this. And so you really want to try to be realistic when you're prepping your arguments for this motion. What can actually change from this small piece of advice that this particular social movement is giving its members? The last thing that I want to kind of highlight is for these kinds of motions, it's often very helpful to get out of, we could say, the stock mindset. So the stock mindset is essentially the mindset that the motion is going to indicate to you what the arguments are supposed to be. And every round should have more or less the same arguments. And the difference between the teams is mostly going to be about how you execute the arguments. It's often the case with debate motions, and there are many motions where there are clear and natural arguments that should be run in every round, and there's not a lot of room to venture outside those arguments. But in a motion like this, I would say almost the opposite is true, where there is a huge amount of different stuff that you could bring to the table argumentatively, and really creativity is being rewarded on a motion like this. So if you had an idea that didn't come up in my breakdown, don't think that means it's a bad idea. I think there are way too many ideas for me to think of or cover here. Just try to focus more on the fundamentals of proving your argument, proving it's important well. And that's a better thing to do in a situation like this where the motion is quite open. Now, the other thing I just want to note from a rules perspective is that here we're talking about an actor motion. So how does that actually affect this debate? It means that instead of considering the proposition, we want this movement to actively encourage its members to do this thing. Instead of kind of considering that proposition from a neutral perspective, we're looking at it from the perspective of the feminist movement. So that's relevant insofar as the feminist movement is going to value different things, have different priorities than the average intelligent voter, or whatever they're calling it these days. So that's something that you're going to want to keep stock of, right? Your impacts have to be important to the feminist movement, not just generically important. And that means that doing some actor analysis of what the actor wants is often very useful. Now, just because you're debating from the perspective of the actor doesn't mean you have to pretend to be the actor. You can say things that you don't think the actor knows about, or arguments you don't think the actor has yet appreciated. That's all okay. You're just debating with a view to the values of the actor as they exist. Okay, so let's get into this motion a little bit more properly now. So firstly, what I want to do is just kind of read through the motion briefly. This House, as the feminist movement, would actively encourage its members to confront close friends and family who display subtle misogynistic behavior. And so let's come back to that in a sec. Looking at this info slide, what do we get? We get a definition of what misogynistic behavior is. We get some examples of subtle behavior. So that's what we're talking about in this motion. This is what the feminist movement is encouraging people to confront their friends and family over. And then we also get some examples of overt behaviors, presumably as examples of what the feminist movement is not encouraging its members to do in the context of this motion. That doesn't mean that they don't encourage them to do that. It just means that that's not what we're debating about. Okay, so let's start out with government. And what I want to do here is just cover a few motion ideas, and then we'll go through one of those ideas in more depth, and then we can move over to opposition and cover some more ideas there. So I think the most natural idea on this motion is just reducing interpersonal misogyny. So this is a point, I think maybe one of the only points in the round that's really given to you by the motion. So if the feminist movement is encouraging its members to confront people who are doing this thing, and it's a bad thing, then presumably we want to say on government that less of the bad thing is going to happen. So that's a very easy idea, and we're going to develop that more, so I won't talk too much about it. The second idea that's maybe a little bit more subtle, and again, remember here there's lots of ideas that you could have, is perhaps the members who end up confronting these people become a little bit happier. I said happier members. Why is that? Well, let's say that you're the kind of person who is going to be in a position to be considered a feminist, such that you're a member of the movement, you're within the motion, and you're also the kind of member who would listen to something that people who are influential in this movement tell you. That's the kind of person who probably cares a lot about issues of gender fairness, let's say. And as a consequence, if you do have people in your life who are doing these subtly misogynistic things, that's probably going to bother you a lot more than the average person, both in the sense that it's unpleasant for you to be around, but also in the sense that if you think that it's really bad to do something like this, and you see in other aspects of your life your role as to kind of contribute to solve this problem, because you're a feminist, there's this kind of tension that's created when you let the behavior slide with people who are really close to you. And so this is an interesting argument and something worth highlighting, because it actually doesn't depend on the success of the confrontations at all. So even if you confront a family member and they refuse to change their behavior, or they say they will change but they really don't, you can feel better about yourself as a consequence of being the kind of person who would speak up about a problem like this. Another idea you might have is confidence building in others. So oftentimes the barrier to raising an issue that you have with another person is you're just kind of afraid about how it will go. It's obviously risky to confront somebody else, and people don't have a lot of models of confrontation going well. And most of the time people don't confront each other, especially not in front of others. And in addition to that, the confrontations that do happen, maybe they don't always go well because they're between strangers, they're between coworkers, something like that. And so maybe if we can prove this, that many of these confrontations are going to be successful, that builds confidence in others to confront subtle misogynistic behavior when they hear about it, when these feminist leaders that are doing this encouragement cite examples. And maybe it will even build their confidence to confront some of these more overt behaviors that aren't directly implicated by the motion, but are nonetheless things that we can claim as impact. So that's another idea that we have. And then maybe Final idea is just maybe a simple accountability thing, where we say oftentimes there are people who are willing to also exert their own social power to try to combat misogynistic behaviors, or we could just say bad behaviors in general, but they're not really aware of the problem as it exists. So you could imagine in a family situation, your parents, your siblings, they might be willing to back you up if you confronted somebody else who was doing something you didn't like, but they might not be affirmatively aware that it was bothering you if you didn't yourself mention it to that person. And so maybe even if you alone confronting somebody else is not enough to change their behavior. So that would be, let's say this argument doesn't work. We can maybe say confronting this friend or this family member together with other friends or other family members, that might increase the odds of success. So that's a kind of plate of ideas that we have. How did we come up with these ideas? We really just tried to think about what the motion was indicating at first, and then we thought about some of the different people that could be involved. So we started out by thinking, how can we change the behavior of the people who are being misogynistic? Then we thought, how can we affect the people who are doing the confronting? Then we thought, how can we affect the people who are maybe watching this confronting happen or hear about it secondhand later? So just walking through the actors in the motion, I think, is a good way to get a kind of set of ideas that you might want to talk about. Okay, so when you're picking between these ideas, there's going to be some strategic things you want to think about. So some of these arguments are higher burden than others. So I would say this argument is harder to prove than this argument. And the reason for that is this argument depends on us showing that the confrontation is usually going to go well, whereas this argument doesn't have that dependency. But as a result, this argument is also a little bit higher impact. And so I just want to walk through this argument because I think it's harder to make, but it's something that you'll be more likely to find success with than the second argument. That's not to say the second argument is bad, just to say the first argument is maybe more natural and a little bit more important. Okay, so let's start with this argument. And how I like to proceed through building an argument is just to kind of ask various questions about it. But before we do any questioning of the argument itself, we might want to think, are there points of characterization that would be useful in a general sense here? So when I say characterization, all I mean is, are there any facts about the world we'd like to describe before we start to make our argument, to have the argument land a little easier, feel a little bit more important, feel more relevant, something like that. So often this characterization on an actor motion is going to include our actor analysis. So here we might just want to say something simple like, the feminist movement has a clear interest in reducing misogyny in the world. And that's kind of the point of the movement, is to promote gender equality. Misogyny is the instantiation of gender inequality, so very natural for the feminist movement to want to get rid of this misogyny. We might say, secondly, a piece of helpful characterization, I already kind of mentioned this, but we're probably talking about fairly dedicated members in the context of a motion like this, right? Because remember, we're relying on the people already being members of the feminist movement to be encouraged, and then we are relying on, of those members, the smaller group of people who actually goes through with that advice. That's a group of people who is unusually committed to the feminist cause. Why are we bringing that up? Because I think it's helpful for some of the stuff that we're going to try to prove a little later. I'll flag it when it comes up. And then thirdly, we want to talk a little bit about, what does this mean? What is it to confront somebody? So here are a few things to keep in mind. One thing to keep in mind is that, at least in debate, none of these words have an essential meaning. So you could imagine confronting somebody by coming up to them and screaming at them. You could imagine confronting someone by just saying, hey, I have a problem with something you did, in a very calm way. So there's no essence to what it is to confront somebody beyond maybe the basic fact that you're telling them that they did something that you didn't like. And what that means is that we have the power on either side of the debate to try to show that the confrontation is going to go a particular way. So here, of course, we're government. We want to say this confrontation is going to go well. And what does that mean? It means it's going to end up with both people still wanting to be in that relationship. So my friend still wants to be my friend, my family member still wants to talk to me, and hopefully we can get them to change their behavior as well. So what can we say to show that the confrontation will probably work well? I think the most obvious thing to say here is just to say there is a pre-existing close relationship, and that affects the incentives of both parties. So the person doing the confronting is approaching this conversation knowing that the other person who they're criticizing is someone they care a lot about. That's why they're doing it. Now, this is kind of in the motion with respect to friends. It says close friends. With family, it's not in the motion. So I guess you could think, what if my second cousin is doing the subtle misogynistic behavior? I think the answer to that is just to say that obviously confronting somebody is something that takes work to do. It's emotionally demanding. And you're only going to do it if you care about interacting with the person, because if you don't really care about interacting with them, like your second cousin who you don't really care about, then you'll probably just stop talking to them. Okay, so we know that these people are close to each other. That means the party doing the confronting is going to want to be calm, want to be measured in their criticism, and the party receiving the criticism is also going to know that this isn't coming from a place of malice or a place of hatred, but maybe a genuine problem is being raised, and that's going to lead to both of them trying to work together to find a solution that keeps the relationship working, at least at the outset. Okay, so that's our characterization. Let's get into this argument. So let's ask some questions. So the first question we're going to ask here is actually kind of a step back from what I said the argument was going to be, and that's often the case with these arguments. You're going to want to start a little bit farther back. So we're going to ask, what are the origins of subtly misogynistic behavior? So why are we asking this question? We're asking this question because that's the kind of behavior we're trying to correct in this argument. And so it's useful to know why people are doing this in the first place. So crucially, we want to explain why they're doing it in a way that makes it so that the confrontation is likely to solve this behavior. So here I think what we want to say is that most of this behavior is uncritically inherited, uncritically inherited from wider society. So how does that work? Maybe it's like you're at school, you're at work, you hear a sexist joke, you repeat the sexist joke, and then you're kind of accustomed in a small way to making jokes like that in general. And if that sort of thing happens to you pretty frequently, you're always in environments where women are being interrupted, you're always in environments where these kinds of jokes are being made, as many people in society are, then over time you just kind of see it as normal and natural to do the same thing without ever really thinking about it. Now, why is it that we inherit so much behavior from other people? Here we just want to give this explanation because it's kind of core to our point. So simply, one, it's important to inherit behavior from other people because it helps us coordinate with them. So if you're at the workplace and you want to know what kinds of jokes are acceptable to make because you want to be funny, you want to make your coworkers laugh, you're going to look at what jokes the coworkers are already telling so that you can kind of coordinate your expectations with them. And then secondly, it's just kind of easy to do. So it's very difficult in life to always be thinking, abstractly, what is an appropriate joke to tell? And it's much easier to just defer to the judgment of the people around you. Well, if they're saying jokes like this, it must be okay to say jokes like this. So that's going to be our account of the origins of subtly misogynistic behavior. Now here we have to be kind of careful not to fall into a trap where we've just identified a source of this behavior, but we've not yet shown that this is the source that explains most of the behavior that we're talking about. So why is this most of the behavior we're talking about? Now here, we're actually going to bring in this piece of characterization we did earlier, which is that the people who are doing the confronting in the situation are dedicated feminists. And what that means is that if these relationships are important to the dedicated feminists, as we've already shown they are, then that means that there must be some selection going on. So you're not going to be friends with somebody who you loathe, presumably, right? Or if there's a family member you really don't like, you're probably not going to spend much time with them. And so by virtue of the feminists being close enough to the people they're confronting to actually do the confrontation, we can infer that these people are probably not super sexist, because otherwise, why are they close to these feminists? So that's not going to be true in all cases, but it's just kind of a general rule that explains why most of the behavior you're talking about is probably limited to this subtle and unconscious misogynistic behavior. The second thing we might say here is just that there are some basic fairness norms in most societies that restrain really outlandish displays of sexism. And you could think here, well, again, we're kind of coming back to this coordination point. In kindergarten, you learn that you can't just do whatever you want. You can't, take somebody else's toy when they're playing with it. If you want to do something that adversely affects somebody else, you probably need a good reason. And that teaches you that arbitrary discrimination, so taking someone else's toy just because you want it without any reason why you should have the toy, is not looked favorably on in society. And those fairness norms probably apply, at least to some extent, to sexism, where if we are saying something about the accomplishments of a woman that we wouldn't say about the accomplishments of a man, the same worry that we're saying something arbitrary kicks in, and people are maybe a little bit uncomfortable with doing that. But crucially, they're uncomfortable if they're conscious of what they're doing. And so this kind of supports our explanation that they're probably not so conscious about what they're doing. Okay. Now we can move on to the meat of the arguments. We might here ask, why is confrontation likely to work? So here, notice we've moved from the background of the argument, where we've described the problem, and now we're describing the solution to the problem with reference to the motion. So the theory here is just that if the feminist movement encourages members to confront people who do this behavior, some of them will go out and confront them, and now we're trying to explain why those confrontations are successful. So we could say a few things here, right? The first is just to rely on our existing characterization. There are incentives to change. So if you are being confronted by, let's say, your niece, and your niece is telling you that, she likes you in general, but you're always saying these things that are offensive to her just in passing. And you also like spending time with your niece, right, because you're in a close relationship. You just have a natural incentive to smooth things over, to try to make changes. It's unlikely that this kind of subtle misogynistic behavior is super important to you, right? The right to tell a sexist joke is not the be-all, end-all of your social life. And so you just have an innate incentive to change, regardless of this work that we've done up here. But secondly, because you had previously accepted these uncritically, the critical examination that's provoked by somebody calling you out is more likely to be successful here. Because since you weren't aware of the subtle misogyny that you were engaging in before, you have just become aware of it, and you haven't yet had a chance to rationalize what you're doing and provide all of these reasons that are going to be difficult for the person who is confronting you to overcome. And so because you're confronting it for the first time, and you haven't yet had a chance to make this a kind of important part of who you are that you need to defend, you'll be less defensive and more willing, or let's say more receptive to what the person confronting you says. Okay. And now we just want to finish this argument off with an explanation of why this is important. But why is this so great? So here we could say a few things, and I just want to proceed up the chain of impacts from the things that are the most obviously related to the argument to the things that are maybe the farthest away from the argument. So let's start with just behavioral changes. So now in my, uncle-niece hypothetical, this relationship works better because the uncle isn't unintentionally offending the niece all the time, so the niece feels better, and then the uncle probably sees more of the niece because she's not, a little bit turned off by these things that he's doing. And so it just kind of works better for both parties in an interpersonal way, so that's nice. The second thing is there's probably a way in which this generalizes for the person who changes. So, if my niece tells me, Max, you're always interrupting women, I'll try to stop interrupting my niece, but I'm probably also going to be prompted to think, am I interrupting people at school? Am I interrupting people in the workplace? And so that behavior can generalize in a positive way. And then thirdly, if we circle back to that initial characterization, which is that we kind of uncritically inherit our subtly misogynistic behaviors from the rest of society, the fewer people who are reproducing that behavior uncritically, and the more people who have been confronted for that behavior in the past, the less this subtle misogynistic behavior will spread in the future. So those all seem like reasonable impacts to conclude from this argument. Okay, so I just walked through one argument in a lot of depth here. I'm going to go through some ideas for op briefly, but this is kind of the process that I think is useful to follow when you're building an argument to make sure you're not missing any steps, everything important is in there, and you're kind of giving good solid reasons based on the motion and common sense for what you're trying to prove. Okay. So opposition. For opposition, I would say there are many ideas that are related to the ideas on proposition. So one idea is that we can close off channels for change here. So if somebody reacts adversely to being confronted, maybe the way that works is they don't stop talking to you entirely, they don't get angry with you entirely, but they stop talking to you about politics or political subjects or social issues because they feel defensive, they feel criticized by you on those subjects, they feel like you think they're a bad person for what they say, and so they just don't talk to you about that sort of stuff anymore. And that's a problem because probably if you are a dedicated feminist, you're one source of a perspective in this person's life that is more egalitarian from a gender perspective. And if we go back to the interests of the feminist movement, beyond just subtle misogynistic behavior, feminism has this general interest in reducing misogyny and on all sorts of issues that could be undermined if these dedicated feminists who are the most likely to be talking about these issues are suddenly no longer welcome to talk about them with the people who would probably listen to them the most. The second argument we could just make is that people will react badly to being confronted. This is a very obvious argument, right? People don't like to be criticized, they don't like to be called out, even if you're in a close relationship. In some ways, maybe that makes the criticism hurt more, coming from somebody who you trust, who you thought really liked you, especially if the criticism is coming after you've known the person for a long time, because you're like, well, why were you holding this back? Were you upset with me all these years? And so they can react badly, right? That doesn't mean the relationship has to end, although maybe that's an extreme impact you could go for in some cases. But it could just mean generally scaling back the amount of time you see the person. It could create awkwardness. And this is all important, right? Because these are close personal relationships. People don't have a lot of those, and they're important for all sorts of things that are not really related to feminism, but nonetheless are valuable to feminism. Why are they valuable to feminism? It's worth stopping here for a moment. Firstly, because feminism probably has some interest in the well-being of its members generally. So if they're losing their close relationships, that's not good. But secondarily, and a bit more directly related to the political purpose of the movement, we might say that if people suddenly become aware that following the advice of influential feminists is leading to conflicts in their personal life that makes them less happy, they will probably just engage less with feminism across the board. And so that's bad as well. Thirdly, we might say, and this is a point I want to talk about briefly before wrapping up, we could say this feeds negative media coverage. So when influential feminists are giving this encouragement, that can be seized on by people who are hostile to feminism for other reasons. And one problem, we could say, with this encouragement is that encouraging people to confront other people fits into criticisms that people have of feminism already, which is that feminists tend to overweight the importance of sexism in society, and they tend to be too willing to sacrifice personal relationships that are otherwise good or criticize people who we might think are not doing anything wrong for the sake of trying to combat this problem that's really overblown. Now, you don't have to prove that any of this is true. All you have to show is that this is an existing criticism of feminism, and by encouraging members to do this, it feeds into, in a concrete way, you can quote the words these feminist leaders are saying, it feeds into that negative media coverage and undermines the cultural capital that feminism has to pursue all sorts of other important projects. Okay, so those are my thoughts on the motion. Again, I just want to say if I didn't mention a particular argument in this breakdown, doesn't mean it's not a good argument. There's a lot of room to do different arguments in this motion. These are just some of the things that came up to me. I'm not sure when you're going to watch this. If you're still at the tournament, have a great rest of the tournament. If you're not, I hope you had a good tournament and you go to more. Bye.